Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you again. Here is Jan, currently in Prague, and we also have a Dan. Hello, Dan.
Yeah, hello. Greetings, many greetings to everybody. I'm in the South Bohemia as usual.
Splendid. And we are finishing our 2 months block of Asian podcasts with the best that we saved for the last. We have a good friend, Elisabeth Braw. She is a senior fellow with Atlantic Council. Hello, Lizzie. Where we have you now?
Hello, it's so nice to be with you, and I'm in Berlin this time, which is never a bad idea, and it's particularly nice in the spring.
Splendid. A little bit more about Lizzie. So Elizabeth is big writer. She's originally from Sweden, but now she lives in Washington, United States. She writes for foreign policy. She writes for Political Europe. She's best-selling author. Multiple books already behind her. Most of them at Yale University Press, and the final one is just released in the United States. It's called Goodbye Globalization, The Return of Divided World. By the way, the guys who are listening from Czech Republic or watching us from Czech Republic, very soon this book will be translated to Czech language, and hopefully, Lizzie will come in April to Prague, Czech Republic, so you can have a signed copy. And by basically the label of the book, the name Goodbye Globalization, this is what Elisabeth is doing. She's a renowned world expert on globalization, on supply chains, of problems with supply chains, which is hot topic since beginning of COVID. Before that, of course, as well, but COVID really put it on a spotlight, and it's never a dull topic. So let's start, Dan, with some really pointy question for our expert on globalization.
Yeah, because we are talking about globalization. So the question is clear. It's some sort of a Red Dwarf question, or this is a moment from Red Dwarf and the talk with the toaster. So my first question is, what's your favorite cuisine?
Well, yeah, that you really put me on the spot there. How can I possibly choose one of the many cuisines that you can access on a daily basis as a result of globalization? But because I am in Germany at the moment, I've got to say German cuisine, even though it's not exactly one of the world's most popular. But I will say that how the German cuisine has developed since I first lived here in the 90s, in the early to mid 90s. So now you know roughly how old I am. How the German cuisine has developed is really extraordinary. Back then, it really was mostly meat and potatoes, and now it has such a wide variety of offerings, and that is a result, not least of globalization. And we have seen the same thing in other countries. And I think many people who are maybe slightly older than 20 years old will remember when the first Indian restaurants arrived in their country, or the first Thai restaurants, and the first to arrive was usually an Italian pizza place, right? And it has gone on from there. So we have all benefited from that culinary globalization, and that makes it easier for me to say German cuisine is my favorite, because it's so multifaceted now.
By the way, if you would give me 5 guesses, I wouldn't guess that it's going to be German. So maybe there is something into it. Let's try it. Nothing bad about my German friends, but I wouldn't guess that. But let's move to the real question, and the question is simple, and it's out there. Is globalization over?
Globalization is not over yet, but it's beginning to wind down the way we have seen it over the past 3.5 decades, and it's beginning to wind down. I shouldn't say wind down, because this is not some sort of peaceful process. It is a chaotic process, and globalization is crumbling because the basis on which it was built turned out to be unsustainable. And what I found when writing the book is that several factors against globalization came together to make it almost impossible for globalization to continue the way we had set it up. And the first one was resentment in the countries that exported market economies. And these were Western European and North American countries. They exported their market economies first to Central and Eastern Europe, most importantly perhaps, but also to China, Russia, if we count that as part of Central and Eastern Europe, and to lots of other countries in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, and also Latin and South America. And in many cases, that went well, and it led to incredible prosperity. But the thing is that ordinary citizens at home in Western countries were never asked whether they wanted their countries to participate in globalization. So many of them were always resentful because they felt that many people felt that they had lost their jobs, many people felt they had lost control, and even though it resulted in incredible prosperity, people didn't think so much about that. They thought about the things they didn't like. And then the second thing that happened was that Russia and China turned out to be less cooperative than we thought they would be. And companies were the first to notice this, especially in China. They noticed that China is not going to always be as welcoming as it originally was. And companies started thinking about, what does it mean for us? And already a few years ago, apparel companies started leaving China because conditions were not as incredibly favorable as they once were. And then China became more repressive towards the private sector, and companies started thinking about what does it mean for us? Should we reduce our exposure? Then, of course, came geopolitics on top of all of that, where Russia and China became more hostile to the West, or you could say the West became more hostile to them. But anyway, the hostility increased, and companies were caught in the middle, and they realized it's not going to be as harmonious as it once was. So globalization clashed with geopolitics, and companies were the first to realize that something is shifting. And that's why when I started writing this book, the reason I started writing it was I heard from companies that something fundamental was shifting. And this is before people in the world of policy, and especially before people in the world of academia, were taking this shift seriously, or were even noticing it. But business people were noticing it and trying to figure out what they should do about it.
Okay, it's very, very interesting, especially for me, what I was saying about China, because China says it still wants to open up. But we will be talking about China later. But my next question would be, what are the main consequences for the world economy of this deglobalization process?
This is the big challenge. So the reason we have been able to build this incredible prosperity that we have seen over the past 3.5 decades is that commerce has been able to grow every year, apart from downturns every now and then that are inevitable in a free market economy. But commerce has been able to grow, prosperity has been able to grow because we have been able to intensify trade with countries like China. And now that companies are saying it's not safe to have this degree of exposure to China, and they're trying to think about what does it mean? Should we move manufacturing? And if so, where should we move it? And we're not talking about moving the entire production that they have in China or the entire operations. We're just talking about reducing the exposure they have or the dependence they have. But even that will, in the short term, lead to less revenues for companies because they'll have to set themselves up somewhere else partially. And where is that somewhere else? That requires investment. And even if it's just a small reduction of operations in China, it will lead to worse results on a worse bottom line in the short term. But in the longer term, it's it creates more sustainability because they don't have this incredible exposure to China, and instead they have an alternative hub that looks after some things that China used to look after, that Chinese operations used to look after. So this is a long way of saying that the results for the global economy will probably be a bit worse in the short term than if we had just kept going with China as if everything were normal. But in the longer term, this is actually a more sustainable solution, and it's also, I think, good stewardship of shareholder money and good customer management to not have this incredible exposure and to have alternative places where you conduct your manufacturing. And we should remember that Western companies are not ending their sales to Chinese customers, but what we are instead seeing is that they are essentially decoupling internally. They are keeping Chinese operations for manufacturing to the Chinese market, and what they are setting up in beginning to set up in other countries, because it's a very long and cumbersome process. It's like, moving house, but 1,000 times more difficult, because it's not just moving your facility, it's moving your entire supply chain, and it's so complicated. But when that process begins to be completed, then they will have alternative hubs that look after other parts of the world. And it will be fascinating to see companies carry this out, because nothing like it has been done since the early 90s, when this whole process started of globalization.
Trade, like communication, is two-way highway. You just basically explained decoupling from China, from, let's say, foreigner perspective, especially Western perspective, companies going, I don't know, to Vietnam or India from manufacturing, then nearshoring, friendshoring of some supply chains. But what this decoupling or deglobalization of the mainly Western world from China will mean for China, because this is another part for equation. So what's your thinking about the outlook for Chinese economy from this perspective?
Jan, in the process of writing this book, I realized that for the Chinese leadership, continued economic growth is not the priority. It has been a priority over these past 3.5 decades, because the Chinese leadership knew that they had to change the living conditions for the Chinese population. It was not sustainable to have people live on very low incomes, travel by bike, and so forth. They knew they needed to change something fundamentally, which they did, starting with Deng Xiaoping, who created these capitalist islands in communist China, and has grown from there. But the Chinese leadership is never going to make the free market and increased prosperity such a priority that it makes itself redundant. And so when we look at what the consequences are for China of decreased commercial links with Western countries, it will lead to a lower growth rate for the economy. But that may not bother the Chinese leadership, because what the Chinese leadership wants is to remain in power for a very long time. And that's why the Chinese authorities have also cracked down on Chinese companies, because they were becoming too powerful. And I think it was such a pivotal moment, or key moment, in the history of the market economy in China, when the Chinese authorities cracked down on Jack Ma, who is the country's most famous entrepreneur, most successful entrepreneur, most iconic entrepreneur. And they cracked down on him for reasons that seemed very mysterious and overblown. And they did so because he was becoming too powerful. He was becoming a threat to their rule. And they were essentially signaling, we will have a market economy, but it will be on our terms. And that also, of course, caused alarm among Western companies, because they realized it was never a properly free market in China, but it's definitely becoming less free than it was a number of years ago.
You have already told about that the world has realized that it's not a good idea to have so much world production concentrated in one country, and especially in a country like China that is not a democratic country. But I would like to know how companies reacted on the, especially on the COVID times in China, because that was a COVID time when a lot of companies realized what's going on, and so how they reacted on this.
COVID really was an incredibly powerful juncture when what happened first was that the Western public realized that, oh, the Chinese authorities are not being transparent with us, and it doesn't matter where COVID originated. That's I think almost inconsequential. What mattered is that the Chinese authorities were not transparent with the global public, with other countries, about the fact that this virus was spreading. And as a result, it spread all over the world. And we had this global pandemic that caused the loss of so many lives. And that's when ordinary people realized, oh, we don't trust China. They hadn't really been paying attention to the Chinese leadership before. I mean, if it was just the leadership of another country, but that's when people realized that they couldn't trust China. And at the same time, once all these lockdowns kicked in, including lockdowns in China itself, companies realized how incredibly vulnerable they were to disruptions in China. And on this occasion, it really was disruptions caused by Mother Nature, because a pandemic means you will have to close facilities, you will have to close, suspend operations, and so forth. But then they started thinking about, what if a pandemic happens again? What if something else happens in China? What if there are other disruptions in China that are caused, that are man-made, caused by political interference? And they realized that they were too vulnerable to such disruptions, and they started thinking about how to make their supply chains less vulnerable. And actually, a good example of how vulnerable supply chains can be, even if it just involves one component of a major manufacturing product, came in Fukushima. So a decade before COVID. So Fukushima obviously caused devastation in parts of Japan. And one of the companies that were located near in the disaster area was a company that makes a certain pigment that is used for the color that goes on cars, the shiny pigment, the pigment that makes colors or the paint shiny. That company had to close for some time after the tsunami, because it had been damaged by the tsunami. And that meant that Western manufacturers, or auto manufacturers around the world, but essentially the big ones, big European and American ones, weren't getting this pigment for their paint, which meant that they couldn't deliver the cars that had been ordered with shiny paint. And this Japanese company was so good that it dominated the market for this shiny pigment. And that also meant that even though this Japanese company had nothing to do with the tsunami, it was just an innocent victim, it meant that companies realized we can't just rely on one supplier, because it will, even if it's just one tiny component, it will cause incredible disruption to our operations. So they went from single source, auto manufacturers went from single source supply to at least dual source. And that's the same realization that companies had during COVID as well, on a much bigger scale, because obviously COVID and China played a much bigger role in companies' supply chains and their problems during COVID than this little Japanese company did during the tsunami and the delivery of that pigment.
If we move from Japan a little bit closer to Europe, where all of three of us are now, so the big topic now are Houthis and the shipping line from Asia at large to Europe and the West, because the Yemen Houthis near the Suez Canal are basically forcing all the shipment not to go through Suez and Egypt to Mediterranean, but to go around the whole Africa. How big problem is it for European businesses, and also for, I would say, our European or Western grandeur, if we are not able to solve problem like Houthis?
What the Houthis have managed to do in the Red Sea is extraordinary. So they have discovered, or they concluded, that by launching attacks against shipping, they could frighten shipping lines and their insurers, and as a result, cause disruption to global manufacturing, global commerce. And they realized that it doesn't matter whether their missiles are any good, whether they always manage to hit the ships. What matters is that it creates fear among shipping lines, and the shipping lines will say, "Well, it's too dangerous to go through the Red Sea. We will detour and go around the Cape of Good Hope." And so, as a result, this little ragtag militia that before this happened had very little name recognition globally now dominates international news because it's able to disrupt global commerce. And of course it matters because the way that goods travel to and from Europe is through the Suez Canal, which means that they have to go through the Red Sea. So it's of incredible significance. And that's why the Suez Canal was so important when it was built, because it allowed goods to travel to and from Europe in a much faster fashion than had been the case before when they traveled around the Cape of Good Hope. And now, thanks to this Yemeni militia, they can no longer go through the Suez Canal. So it was a very clever move by the Houthis. And what was even more clever than deciding that they could target shipping, even though their missiles are not exactly precise, was that they communicated that they would decide which ships would be targeted. So they didn't say any ship that is flagged in Israel or the UK or the US will be targeted. They said, we decide what constitutes an Israeli-linked vessel, what constitutes a US-linked vessel, what constitutes a UK-linked vessel, which means that there's no certainty for any vessel. And as a result, ship owners and managers and insurers, for the most part, have said it's not safe to go through the Red Sea. We will deviate and go around the Cape of Good Hope, and that has caused has had direct effects on commerce and business operations. And for example, as I think your listeners will know, Elon Musk's or the Tesla factory here in Germany had to suspend operations as a direct result of supplies not being able to reach the factory because of these Houthi attacks.
And do you think that this problem will have longer-term consequences for Europe?
It's already having consequences for Europe because of the delays it's causing. And the longer-term consequence, or the more general consequence, is that people are getting concerned about the decreasing or the deteriorating conditions on the world's oceans. So if this can happen in the Red Sea, another militia group or some sort of outfit, a proxy group, a state operating through a proxy group, they can do this again to harm Western countries and Western commerce. So it's the direct effect that it's already having on manufacturing and the delivery of products, but also the more general and longer term effect of decreasing confidence in a globally operating economy. Because how are factories and any sort of companies, how are they supposed to be able to plan and have a strategy if some group can pop up somewhere and disrupt vital logistics for reasons totally unrelated to any company or any actions of any company.
By the way, we haven't seen in Europe what's going on in the United States now. United States is trying to return at least part of its production back to home. We can't see this process in Europe yet. But when we stay in the United States, what is your opinion on this? It is a smart step, it is a forced step, or how would you interpret it?
So the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this massive package that incentivizes the creation of green technology jobs or green jobs in the United States. For the US, you can say it's a win-win-win. It's a way that through which the US government, with funds provided by Congress, can incentivize companies to invest in green manufacturing jobs in the US. As a result, reduce dependence on China. So there are already two wins there. Reduce dependence on China, create green manufacturing jobs at home. And then the third win is obviously that this helps the green transformation. So it's a good thing for the United States. It's also quite protectionist, but if this is what the Americans want to do, they manage to do it well with the IRA, and we're already seeing all kinds of companies, including European companies, unfortunately, go after this funding, unsurprisingly, because it is very attractive, and set up operations in the United States. So the US did well for itself with this legislation. Unfortunately, it also it did so without consulting its best friends, namely European countries. And I still don't understand whether it is the case that the Congress, Congress and the administration, whether they didn't appreciate the effect this would have on America's allies, and they just got the legislation done, or whether they did appreciate it and they did it anyway. But it's a difficult situation for European countries, because European countries and indeed the EU, we don't have this sort of money, this massive allocation of money that we can throw after companies to incentivize them to bring manufacturing, especially green manufacturing, to our countries. So it is a bit unfair, not just a bit, it is unfair. And European countries will suffer as a result, because there are companies that are trying to minimize their exposure to China are more likely to go to the United States as a result of this. And I would think, it would be a good thing if they were to come to back to Europe, even if it's not to their original country, at least to somewhere in Europe. But so I guess you can say all is fair in love and war and commerce, and the Americans did what was right for them, and now the EU will need to be equally aggressive in trying to create maybe a package that is somewhat similar in ambition and scope, even if the funds won't be as generous.
I honestly believe that Inflation Reduction Act is a brilliant piece of legislation, and it's really, it's beautifully written in its simplicity. So we in Europe, we are working for years and years for Green Deal that is slowly suffocating us, and it maybe will basically eat us alive. And now I'm not talking about the vision, but really the paperwork that's behind it. And in case of US, it's a really simple, beautiful piece of legislation. And by the way, if there is one nice touch of this law, and it's connected to globalization, it's author or authoress, because the law, one of the mastermind behind, is Catherine Tai, U.S. Trade Representative, and her life, and you can Google her or go on Wikipedia. She was born in Taiwan, Then she worked in Sun Yat-sen University in Guangdong province, China. Then she moved to World Trade Organization and then worked for some attorney firms in DC. And now, as a Asian, is running sort of like the globalization through Inflation Reduction Act, which is going against mostly European businesses. So this is good piece how the world is interconnected. But if we stay on Western Hemisphere and go a little bit south to Mexico, so Mexico is set to become a largest exporter to United States. So it's really important country for U.S. economy or for whole Western Hemisphere. At the same time, we could see sharp increase of Chinese imports to Mexico. It is a sign the decoupling process will be longer and painful for both sides. By the way, um, International Institute of Finance in Washington is every month releasing similar papers of diverting of trade. In their case, they are writing about Russia and how the European Russian trade is being diverted via Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And some countries, including, for example, Germany, where Ulysses are now, basically opened their arms exactly 2 years ago and they found Kyrgyzstan. And for example, Berlin exports to Kyrgyzstan is up to 1900%. By the way, Czech Republic is the same. So basically, it's a big topic now whether China is basically not trying to dominate / United States via Mexico.
That is it is an interesting theory. I'm not somebody who likes conspiracy theories, but I think the point is that China is not going to try to keep companies against their will. It will, however, signal that it's not just the case that you can just leave China and China would just accept it. And a good sign of that is, or an interesting expression of that, is how Chinese harassment of Philippine vessels has increased. So why does that have to do with Mexico, you may ask? Well, China is signaling to companies that are friendshoring that thinking of friendshoring to the Philippines that, it may not be safe for you to friendshore to the Philippines, because how are you going to get your supplies in and out of the country? And it's absolutely vital to get their supplies in and out of the country if it's going to work. But if with maritime harassment, shipping companies are less likely to want to ship to and from the Philippines. Obviously, they'll still ship some things, but to expand operations and to make the necessary investments in the Philippines, for that to happen, shipping companies will have to have confidence that this is a good place to and from, with which to do business, and it's a safe place for ships to operate in. And if China then signals, ships sailing to and from the Philippines can get into trouble, then that will give manufacturers and shipping lines a massive headache about whether that's a wise strategy. And then when we look at Mexico, I don't think that China is in any way sort of instrumentalizing the rise of Mexico, but it's also the case that China is not retreating. It's not becoming isolationist. It's just asserting itself vis-a-vis unfettered private markets and what it considers to be too much Western power. And it has considerable power itself, which it can use and will use at convenient opportunities or whenever it deems it wants to use this power. And that's what makes things so unpredictable at the moment, because as long as China plays a considerable role in the globalized economy, we are vulnerable to whatever the Chinese government decides to do, even if our companies are not in China and are not as exposed or as dependent on China as they've been until now. And that vulnerability will remain because we can't completely cut off links with China. It's impossible. And they have taken over 35 years to build. And if we're going to dismantle them, it's going to take another 35 years, and it wouldn't even be desirable. So it's just something we have to bear in mind. And the other thing I wanted to mention and I should have mentioned earlier, but on the related note, is that insurance companies are critical in this whole discussion, because they are the ones that will have to insure companies against political interference. In China and elsewhere, already companies can't buy political risk insurance, Western political risk insurance for Russia, because Russia is under sanctions. They also can't buy it for Ukraine because it's too risky for underwriters to write new political risk insurance policies in Ukraine, considering there's already a war. But what is really fascinating, what has been happening in the past few months, is that political risk underwriters, who are the ones that cover everything from political interference, asset seizure, coups, civil wars, conflicts, and wars, they have essentially stopped writing new policies in China. They consider China too risky. So that means that if you don't already have political risk insurance in China, you won't be able to get it. And that really says something about how insurers assess the Chinese government's willingness to interfere.
Unfortunately, China has a very strong card in its hand, and it's a unique supply chain, and especially in some areas, like the best example is new energy products, and generally is in a very strong position in the global manufacturing. It's very important to mention it because this is really a thing that will be very difficult to disrupt. So how difficult it will be, in fact, to disrupt all the ties with China, or not all the ties, but to some extent at least.
It will be very difficult, and I don't think it will be possible and desirable to minimize the links. But what needs to happen is that the incredible exposure companies have today needs to be reduced, so that they are not vulnerable to whatever the Chinese government may think up. And it will be in their interest to keep doing business in China, but not to be so fully dependent on it. But to reduce that exposure, first of all, you have to make the decision. Then you have to find countries, other countries in which you can do your operations, and you also have to then decide, well, should we just move manufacturing, or should we try to also move sales, and so that we are less dependent on the Chinese market for our revenues? And no one country will replace China. It's going to be a combination of countries. It's going to be hubs of countries. So there will be a hub involving the Philippines, a hub involving India, which is getting an unexpected second chance at globalization, participation in globalization. It was always a very strong candidate, and then almost every company, manufacturing company and otherwise, went with China because it was just much more stable, and it was able to provide the logistics much faster because it's a centrally ruled country and an authoritarian country. So obviously China has that advantage vis-a-vis India. Now India is getting a second chance, and I think what will be fascinating to watch is whether India can capitalize on it. Then we will have another hub around Mexico. But it's going to be a long process for companies to build those hubs. But what we are already seeing is that it's already happening. So, for example, Siemens announced new investments a few months ago, and when those figures came out, and we should remember Siemens is a perennial participation in the Chinese economy has been since the earliest days of when China opened up. So a few months ago, Siemens announced it was investing more money in R&D in China, I think around 200 million euros. Then a week later, it announced that it was investing 1 billion euros in Germany and $200 million in South Carolina. Well, that says something. It says that Siemens is doing what other great manufacturing companies are doing. It's essentially splitting, decoupling internally, continuing its focus on China for the Chinese market, but increasing its investments and plans for hubs outside China that can look after the rest of the world.
If you can quickly summarize, okay, after our, let's say, 40-minute conversation, and based on your years of experience and expertise, what is outlook from your perspective for global supply chains?
I think this is a necessary adjustment that we are seeing. It was always too perilous to have a whole system that was based on every country playing by the rules, including countries that don't share much with us except an interest in consumer products or indeed any products. So it was always a dream to think that would work. And political developments and COVID showed us that it didn't work. So now we are seeing this necessary adjustment that should have maybe have happened years ago. It's happening now, and I don't envy the CEOs who are in charge, who will have to combine these quite significant investments and long-term strategies with quarterly reports, and all doing this all while actually not being very not having much experience with geopolitics, because they have to navigate these two things, the commercial realities and the geopolitical realities, at the same time. So credit to the ones that are really trying to do it. I think what we're seeing now will accelerate. More companies will realize they need to do it, and they will follow the pioneers who are inevitably large companies. And it's interesting to contemplate how much things are shifting. The CEO of Stellantis, which is one of the world's largest car manufacturers, automotive manufacturers, he even, in a public setting at a conference recently, he thought aloud about he asked the question, do companies like mine even need factories in China anymore? Well, 5-10 years ago, that would have been an unthinkable question. And now somebody like him dares to ask it in the public setting. So this is how much the ground is shifting. But then it's also worth remembering how incredibly difficult it is to completely leave a country, which is why Western manufacturers won't completely leave China, whereas Western companies operating in Russia are trying to completely leave the country. And if a country doesn't want you to leave, it can put up all kinds of hurdles, which is what's happening in Russia.
Thanks for a great conversation, and we are looking forward to having your book and you in person in Czech Republic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.